Hello everyone, and welcome to this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group, with Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters across the franchised and independent dealer sectors.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this special Motor Trade Radio weekday podcast interview. Today we're delighted to welcome back friend of the podcast, Steve Young, Managing Director of ICDP, the International Automotive Retailing and After Sales Consultancy. Steve is joining us for the latest in our regular chats about some of the trends impacting the car retailing sector. So welcome back, Steve, and I understand you're joining us from Verona today.
Yeah, I am, Curtis, and hi to yourself and to Philip, and thanks for the invitation back. Verona is the home of the annual Automotive Dealer Days, which has sees 4,000 or 5,000 people converge, mainly Italian, and in a mini NADA type event. So
yeah.
The dealers come because the manufacturers also hold their dealer meetings here, and then the sort of discussion content, I'm sure, in the dealer meetings, but also in the open sessions, is around all the issues that we're familiar with around agency, around electrification, and so on. So Italy's obviously behind in some of those trends. They're not in the first line, but it's still coming, and the dealers are concerned.
And any familiar faces from the UK out there?
Well, I ran into the guys from Vivendi earlier on. We've got Jason Cranswick from Marubeni is speaking tomorrow, and obviously myself and my colleague Gareth Arnold from ICDP. So you've got the great and the good, and ICDP.
He's there as well. Well, I mean, welcome back and welcome from Verona. So, I mean, you know, it's always good to have these catch-ups with you, and it's never a dull moment to talk about what's going on. But I think we want to start by quizzing on a few sort of recent headlines that have taken up this sort of recent few weeks in the automotive sector. But obviously this week we've had the more immediate one as following the announcement from Stellantis on Tuesday that it said it will be unable to meet the Brexit trade rules on where parts are sourced from next year. And now this will, and saying that it will impact on their EV production plans for the UK. Now, obviously, they're referring to the rules of origin following the Brexit decision. What are your thoughts around this? I mean, this is, we kind of knew this was going to come out at some point and be a problem, didn't we? But it's now coming to a head that we're not far away from this point.
Yeah, I think as you said, we knew it was coming. I think the whole Brexit thing has been a disaster for the industry, and the disaster will just keep on rolling. So we don't have the investment in battery capacity in the UK. If you were one of the large global firms producing batteries, then why would you pick the UK? We've lost manufacturing capacity here in the volume sector. We're outside of the EU. We're on the western side of Europe. They're about the only. Well, it might even actually be better off producing your batteries in Cork, because at least that's in the EU. We're not, but we're still equally distant from most of the main manufacturing centres. So it's not a surprise. I think there's the usual posturing going on, as there is with any manufacturer government discussion, to try and get some sort of support. But we would need battery capacity in the UK, something Andy Palmer, ex Nissan and Aston, has gone on about quite extensively and vocally in recent months. It's not happening.
And obviously this is Stellantis is referring to Vauxhall. In the UK, we do obviously export 80% of our production. And obviously we EV is playing directly into this because of obviously the value of that battery into it be making up a high cost of the vehicle. I mean, from your perspective, you've touched on it there, how could this impact on, EV production in the UK? Because that leads right back to your comment there around battery production that we haven't got currently in the UK. Obviously, we had the British Volt element, which is now obviously owned by the Australian business. But is there any plans? Do you think the UK government will do anything around this?
Unfortunately, I don't think they will. I mean, Nissan have got their own, effectively sort of dedicated battery production for Sunderland. So you can see that's working, and it's one of the star performing sites within the Nissan sort of global network. So, Sunderland's pretty safe. Toyota's only really coming to the BEV party now, but what will they do for battery supply for Burniston? I think, Jaguar have said last week, I think, that 2 weeks ago, that their new EV range from 25 will have a UK sourced battery, and have referenced Tata as the producer of those batteries, but I've not heard anything, in terms of announcements of a site or capacity or anything else. Perhaps that might be an opportunity. But as for Stellantis, for the production out of Ellesmere Port and Luton for the vans, then at the moment they've got nowhere to go.
And by way of a follow-up, Steve, in the BBC's coverage of this story, they mentioned that that this issue could apply to other European countries. They didn't actually name which ones, and the suggestion was that if it does affect countries within the EU, then that may give a little bit of leverage into relaxing the rule changes. Any thoughts on that?
I don't actually see how that makes sense, because the requirement is for production within the EU, not production within the individual countries. Because of the way that the EU is based, actually founded on trading across open borders, then it doesn't matter if you're in I don't know, take the Netherlands as an example, where you have the facility at Born. If they source their batteries from France, or the Audi plant in Brussels sources their batteries from France or Germany or wherever, then it doesn't matter. It's still within the EU.
Yeah.
So I don't see that as being an issue. And off the top of my head, I can't think of any manufacturing plants that are outside of the EU. Unless you were looking at something like Ford Otosan in Turkey or something like that.
Yeah, sure. Well, something else we knew was coming, and which we actually talked about last time you were on the podcast, was JLR's move to this house of brands style of representation, with Jaguar exiting most of its showrooms around the world as it goes more upmarket and fully electric. Now, last week, in the headlines, Vertu became the first UK dealer group to reveal its plans, saying it was removing Jaguar from 5 of its 6 JLR sites, and also booking a £1.5 million impairment charge against the termination, and clearly others will follow. Now, will fully Land Rover dual arch sites be sustainable in your mind, or do you expect to see dealers move to dual franchising within what are these big sites?
I think it's not so much that Vertu have removed Jaguar, but Jaguar has removed 4 of the Vertu sites, so 5 of the Vertu sites. So, and I suspect, to be honest, there's probably a little bit of posturing or messaging going on from Robert Forrester in that one, that let's just make sure that people understand that we're being shafted by the manufacturers. So let's take the provision, let's take the impairment. But behind that, I do think genuinely that there's an issue, and I think the issue is more than 200,000 a site. I think that's quite a modest provision if you think that many of the Arch sites were sort of 10 million plus investments to be covered by two brands, with a reasonably sizable Jaguar volume going through it. If you consider it going right the way from XE and E-Pace up, that's no longer going to be the case. And would you build a site of that size if you were only selling the Land Rover family of brands? And I think the answer to that is no. So will the sites be, the sites were probably never viable, to be perfectly honest, in reality, as opposed to whatever the business case was. They were over invested for the size of the two brands together. I still think they would be over invested against future requirements for what you would really need for the Land Rover brands. And you're then going to be looking at and particularly then with agency coming along for both Jaguar and Land Rover in the UK from January 25, then I think we'll be looking at bigger impairments and for the sites as a whole, not just for the Jaguar element of it.
And how do you think other OEMs would feel about being shoehorned into a dual arch site? Do you think there'll be any kickback from that?
I think there might be some kickback from Jaguar Land Rover, because they will, given that Jerry McGovern is their so-called chief creative officer and is behind a lot of this stuff, then he will, no doubt have a view about spoiling the design integrity of a dual arch site. But having said that, if you look at multi-brand dealerships in general, then you look at the Stellantis house, the Stellantis house concept, then it is very much sort of a multi-arch building, and lots of multi-brand sites are. So quite easy to change the cladding on the right-hand half and change the badging, and so the left-hand half becomes Land Rover and the right-hand half becomes whatever. And it will come down to the economics at the time and the balance of power between the dealers and Jaguar Land Rover and whatever the other brand is. But we have BYD in the Mercedes Stockport site, which was another massive overinvestment. So if we've got BYD in a Mercedes dealership, why shouldn't we have other brands into a JLR Arch?
Yeah, good point. I mean, you kind of see how this is now starting to change in terms of this representation of brands rather than just a single brand within a site. And I mean, we know that Vertu with Robert did cite a reference to the performance of the Mercedes under agency in his financials, but we recently covered the Q1 financials for both Inchcape and Sytner. For the first quarter of each of the group, that they sort of talked about the influence by the shift of some of the OEMs to agency, being Mercedes being the prominent one. And obviously Inchcape reported its 8% revenue growth was adversely impacted by a shift towards agency for certain brands, while Sytner, who are reportedly one of the biggest MB dealer groups in the UK, reported a 1% increase in gross profit, declaring it's satisfied with the move, with an average gross profit of £3,025 per unit per Mercedes car, and that Mercedes-Benz paying a 5% commission on each sale. I mean, is this just a case that it's still early days with this shift to agency? And obviously, you've got different businesses who operate differently. Is it a case that, it's very difficult to do clear like-for-like comparisons on performance because of, the last 3 years that we've just been through and the shift to electrification and other things taking place in the market at the minute?
Yeah, I think it's definitely difficult to do like for like. I mean, we face the same dilemma coming up because we produce our top 50 and top 300 European dealer group rankings on the basis of turnover, and if you have a brand like Mercedes, where the revenue no longer flows through the revenue for the car itself no longer flows through the dealer P&L, then you could be selling, as many thousands of Mercedes as you like, but all you're showing in the P&L statement is the 5% commission line. So the revenue numbers, if your entire business was on agency, your revenue number would be, give or take, 40% down, depending on your new used after sales split. But doing a year-on-year comparison with a non-agency year would be meaningless. So it's going to be quite challenging to do any sort of analytics around dealerships that are moving to agency. And it also depends on the style of agency. So the Stellantis proposal is still agency, still genuine, but a different form, where it's the dealer who raises the invoice. And effectively, it's sort of like a back-to-back wholesale deal, timed with the retail deal. So the revenue still flows through the P&L, but it's agency. So it's all going to be sort of fairly confusing. But I think, to be honest, talking about the impact on your revenue at this stage in the UK is a little bit strange, because we've had 1 quarter of one brand. And yes, it will have had an impact, but not a meaningful impact. It's when more of the brands have gone agency that you'll start to see some apparently crazy numbers, which you'll need to dig into to really understand what's going on.
And give you a headache in your reporting for a few years as well, by the sense of it, Steve.
Yeah, us and plenty others, but yeah, it's life is always full of these little challenges.
And finally, Steve, turning to a recent blog that you posted, you've been talking about dealer consolidation and the potential issue of cross-border complications, which is very topical, bearing in mind you're in a dealer conference in Italy. What's your view on the likely trends here, especially when you look at some of the American businesses looking at the UK, and indeed what else is happening in Europe?
The cross-border consolidation is stepping up. I don't think there's any question about that. I think the two sort of key types which matter are where you've got regional consolidation, which is something which is not an issue in the UK, or not an issue, it's not an opportunity, unless you're looking at Republic of Ireland and the UK. But you have quite a lot of that going on around sort of Belgium, Netherlands, and France, Belgium, Germany. Players like Van Mossel and Car Avenue, who are building regional groups, but it so happens it crosses national boundaries at the same time. But the sort of long distance, arm's length sort of acquisitions, such as we've seen with Lithia and Jardine, or Hedden and the Mercedes sort of retail group, are what we're going to see in the UK. And we've had that for a long time. We've had Penske here with Sytner, we've had Modus with Pentagon, sort of Marubeni with Norton Way, and so on. So we actually have quite a lot of overseas investors in the UK, probably more so than any other European market. But that is going to increase. Hedden said last week, Anders Hedden said that the Mercedes acquisitions are just a foothold for their future growth. Maybe they come back on Pendragon, maybe they find some other targets. Lithia with Jardine has got sort of an interesting business, but it's right up at the super premium end, and they need to grow that out. So they'll be making some more acquisitions. And Van Mossel, which most UK listeners will not have heard of, has been super aggressive. They made 25 different deals in the last 3 years that we track, and they're going to be announcing a UK acquisition within the next couple of weeks. So that brings another continental European investor here, and there's one or two others that we know are looking. So it's going to be a very busy time in terms of cross-border acquisition that affects the UK.
Well, it sounds like you've just announced a scoop on the podcast. Van Mossel buying into the UK in the next couple of weeks.
Well, it's something we heard of a while back, but it was actually I can say it openly because Eric Berkhoff, who's the CEO, mentioned it in an interview with a Dutch journalist last week.
Right.
So it is now official.
Interesting. The cat is out of the bag.
The cat is officially out of the bag. So our next podcast we can talk about what Van Mossel has bought.
And and share with the listeners who they are and where they're represented now, probably as well. Because I think, as you say, there's these operators that really nobody. I mean, Lithia really wasn't on the listener for anybody in the UK, was it? They were very much in the US, but not outside of the US. So no, it is going to get very interesting. I think this plays out that the UK is still a value proposition, isn't it, for these international and European investors?
Well, it's still, I think, the most sophisticated retail market. I mean, it may not produce the same profits as being a dealer in the States or whatever, but that's all to do with context. And if you look at actually what the dealers are doing, then the dealers in the UK are, I think, stronger than anywhere else in the world. They run a better balanced businesses across new, used, after sales. They do a better but morally acceptable job around F&I. I've got some personal reservations about the approaches in the US. They do a great job on e-commerce and sort of digital investments in application of AI and data science to making decisions. The list goes on. They're just very good operators right across the piece. Yeah. And so as an overseas investor, then you're buying into a skill set that's not immediately transferable. You can't start from the UK running your used car business across all of Europe because the steering wheel's on the wrong side to start off with.
Yes.
But you can certainly take some of those lessons and say, we'll run our German business, our Belgian business, our Swedish business, or whatever with some of these tools. We can still apply the tools. We can still take a look at the balance and finance agreements and proactively approach the customer at 30 months or whatever it might be to say, look, have I got a deal for you? So, use of video, another example, we're way ahead of most of the European markets in terms of using video for communicating with customers. So there's lots of individual lessons that can be transferred.
Yeah. No, I think you probably, all the CEOs within the UK are probably saying they've been shouting that for years of how advanced the UK market is compared to some of the European and international counterparts, aren't they? And I think we're starting to see some of this play out around EV, around agency, as you say, that digital e-commerce space. It's now starting to become apparent how advanced the UK is compared to, like you say, some of the European and international counterparts. But like you say, we'll maybe save that for another month, another podcast and thing. But I mean, as always, it's always fascinating, and we always say we can fill hours talking about what's happening in the sector with you, Steve. And those that again haven't subscribed to ICDP and Steve's blogs, then I strongly advise you to do so. They are available to subscribe from the ICDP website. That's icdp.net. Or if you're not connected with Steve on in the social space, then please do connect up with Steve, and you'll see some of his blogs come through either LinkedIn or the channel. So they're always a fascinating read, and again, the membership of the ICDP is of great value. Those that can get on there as well from a UK and European perspective as well. So again, thanks for joining us today, Steve. It's been fascinating, and all the best over there in Verona. And I'm sure we can talk about what you heard next time you come on the podcast.
That'd be great, Philip. Appreciate it, and always fun having a chat.
Many thanks, Steve.
Cheers, Curtis.
That's all for now. Many thanks for joining us for this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast. Thanks once again to Steve for joining us today from Verona. We're back with the headlines on Saturday. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
Thank you for listening to this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group. Philip and Curtis will be back with the week's big motor retailing headlines on Saturday. Live, on demand, wherever you are, and on your podcast feed. In the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with Philip and Curtis, come on the show or send a press release, then email them at motortraderadio@yahoo.com. You can also join the Motor Trade Radio, LinkedIn and Facebook groups, or follow the podcast on Twitter. You've been listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast, bringing you all the chatter that matters.